It was a hot afternoon when the young boy stepped out of his house, ready to make the short walk to the corner store. He had just enough money to pick up a snack and a drink, something to cool off after a long day. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where most people kept to themselves, where life moved at its own pace. The air felt thick with the heat, and the sun blazed in the clear blue sky, casting shadows on the sidewalk. As he walked, his mind wasn't on anything too heavy. He thought about the latest game he had played, the conversation he'd had with his friends earlier that day. Maybe he'd try a new flavor of soda, something to make the afternoon feel special. His sneakers scuffed the pavement as he made his way down the street, the rhythmic sound of his steps filling the silence around him. The boy's neighborhood wasn't the best place to live. People around here didn't always trust each other, especially when it came to outsiders. Racial tension had been a part of the community for as long as anyone could remember. Still, the boy had never really paid much attention to it. He was used to being one of the few black faces around, but that didn't stop him from going about his day-to-day life. He was a good kid, someone who respected the rules and kept to himself. But today, he would find out that the world didn't always see him that way. As the boy neared the corner of the street, he noticed the flashing lights of a police car pulling up. He didn't think much of it at first. Police officers were a common sight in the area, but something about this one felt different. The officer slowed the car to a stop, his eyes locking onto the boy as he drove by. The car came to a halt just a few feet away from him. The boy's heart skipped a beat. The officer, a man in his early 30s, stepped out of the car with a look of determination on his face. His hand rested on his belt near the holstered gun, and the boy felt a sudden sense of unease. The officer's gaze was hard, unwelcoming, like he was already making judgments before he even said a word. "Hey, you there," the officer called out, his voice sharp and demanding. The boy, taken aback, stopped in his tracks. He didn't know what to expect, but he had a feeling this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. He tried to steady himself, taking a breath before turning to face the officer. "Can I help you, officer?" the boy asked politely, his voice a little shaky. The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a few steps toward the boy, sizing him up with a scrutinizing stare. The boy shifted uncomfortably under the officer's gaze, sensing the tension building in the air. "What are you doing here?" the officer asked, his voice tight with suspicion. "I'm just walking home from the store," the boy replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I was just picking up something to drink." The officer seemed to pause, as though considering the boy's words, but the suspicion in his eyes didn't fade. He took another step closer, now just a few feet away. "You got any ID on you?" the officer asked suddenly. The boy hesitated for a moment. He wasn't sure why the officer was asking for ID, especially since he hadn't done anything wrong. But he reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet and handing over his ID without a word. The officer glanced at it quickly, not even taking the time to read the details. He just stared at the picture, then looked back up at the boy with a raised eyebrow. "This doesn't add up," the officer muttered under his breath, his tone now even more suspicious. The boy felt his heart begin to race. What didn't add up? What had he done wrong? He tried to keep his composure, but the situation was quickly escalating, and he had no idea why. "I don't understand," the boy said quietly. "I'm just heading home." The officer didn't answer. Instead, he took another step toward the boy, crowding him. The boy could feel the officer's presence looming over him, making him feel smaller than he already did. He stepped back instinctively, but the officer followed him, his eyes narrowing. "You know, I've been watching you for a while now," the officer said, his voice growing colder. "You've been walking around here too often. Something doesn't feel right." The boy shook his head, confusion and fear swirling inside him. "I don't understand," he said again, his voice quieter this time. "I live here. I'm just walking to the store." The officer didn't seem interested in listening. Without warning, he grabbed the boy's arm with a firm, painful grip. "You're coming with me," he said, his voice harsh. The boy froze, his pulse pounding in his ears. What was happening? This wasn't right. He hadn't done anything wrong. He wasn't resisting, but the officer's hand on his arm felt like it was going to leave a bruise. The boy tried to pull away, but the officer's grip tightened. "I'm not doing anything," the boy said, his voice pleading. "Please, just let me go." But the officer wasn't listening. His eyes were wild, filled with something the boy couldn't quite name, something dangerous. The officer twisted the boy's arm, forcing him to the ground, pinning him there with his knee. The boy gasped. The wind knocked out of him as he hit the concrete. "Stop! Stop!" the boy cried out, his voice filled with fear. He struggled beneath the officer's weight, trying to break free, but the officer only pressed harder, his knee digging into the boy's back. The world spun around him and he felt helpless, like he had no control over what was happening. A few people in the neighborhood had started to notice, peeking through their windows or stepping out onto their porches. They watched, but none of them moved. They were all too scared to get involved, too scared to speak out. The boy's heart sank as he realized that no one was going to help him. He was on his own. The officer's voice cut through the air, sharp and angry. "You think you can just walk around here without anyone noticing? You're nothing but trouble." The words hit the boy like a slap to the face. He had never been in a situation like this before, and the officer's accusations felt like a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just a kid trying to get home. The boy could feel tears starting to well up in his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. He didn't want to show weakness, not when he was already so scared. But the pain in his arm, the weight of the officer pressing down on him, made it hard to breathe. He was trapped. Just as he thought things couldn't get worse, the sound of another voice broke through the tension. "Hey, what's going on here?" The voice was strong, demanding, and it made the officer hesitate for a moment. The boy couldn't see who had spoken, but he could hear the certainty in the voice, the kind of voice that demanded attention. The officer glanced up, and for a split second, the boy saw the briefest flicker of doubt in the officer's eyes. But then the officer turned away, as if to brush off the interruption. The boy wasn't sure what was about to happen next, but he hoped, he prayed that someone was going to help him before it was too late. The boy's heart raced in his chest as he lay on the ground, still pinned by the officer's weight. He could feel the sharp sting in his arm where the officer was holding him down, and his breaths were shallow, panicked. His mind spun in a blur of confusion and fear, his body frozen under the officer's harsh grip. For a brief moment he wondered if anyone would intervene, but the fear that had built up in the pit of his stomach told him no one would. And then, out of nowhere, a strong voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Hey, what's going on here?" The voice was loud and commanding, different from the others that had just stood by watching in silence. The boy's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the strength behind those words. The officer seemed to falter for a moment, his hand still firmly pressing down on the boy's back. But there was a noticeable shift. For a second, the officer seemed unsure, almost hesitant. The boy barely dared to look up. He was still reeling from the shock of the attack. But the voice that had spoken felt like a lifeline, pulling him out of his panic. His thoughts were racing. Who was this person? Could they help him? The officer shifted his weight slightly, but his grip didn't loosen. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the area before locking onto the man who had spoken. "None of your business," the officer barked, his voice defensive, yet shaky. "This kid's causing trouble." But the man who had spoken wasn't intimidated. The voice that had called out was deep, powerful, and it carried with it a sense of authority that couldn't be ignored. The boy could see a shadow move across his vision, someone standing near, towering over the officer and speaking directly to him. "I don't care what you think," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "You don't have the right to treat him like that." The boy, still gasping for breath and unable to fully process what was happening, was left to wonder who this person was. The crowd of onlookers had stayed silent, unwilling to step in, but now there was someone willing to speak up. This person didn't just walk by or whisper in fear. They had stood their ground and confronted the officer. The officer, taken aback by the man's boldness, looked him up and down. He was probably trying to figure out who this person was. The man was tall and muscular, and the way he carried himself suggested that he was no stranger to conflict. The officer, seeing the defiance in the stranger's eyes, finally stepped back, though just a little. His hand didn't leave the boy's back, and his grip remained tight. But now there was something different. The officer seemed less sure of himself. "Who are you?" the officer asked, his voice low and threatening. "I'm someone who cares about justice," the man replied, his tone unwavering. "And right now you're crossing a line." The tension between the two men hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, the officer looked like he was considering what he was doing. The boy's mind was still foggy with fear, and he couldn't make sense of it all. But he couldn't ignore the growing sense of relief that spread through him. Someone was standing up for him. "Let him go," the man said again, taking a step closer. "Now." The officer hesitated, glancing from the stranger to the boy on the ground. The man didn't flinch, didn't back away. He stood his ground, unwavering, while the officer's grip seemed to loosen just slightly. The boy, still terrified, wondered if this could really work. Would this man's words be enough to stop the officer from continuing to hurt him? The officer's eyes flickered, a mix of frustration and confusion flashing across his face. He looked down at the boy, who was still pinned to the ground, trembling beneath him. The officer's breath came fast, his chest rising and falling as he tried to regain control of the situation. But the stranger's presence was undeniable. It was clear now that he wouldn't back down. The officer's authority, once seemingly unchallenged, was starting to crack. "I said let him go," the man repeated, his voice louder now, more commanding. His presence was overwhelming, filling the space with the power of someone who had nothing to fear. The officer's face twisted, his jaw clenching. But in the face of this new threat, he realized there wasn't much he could do. He had no choice but to stand down. With one final reluctant movement, the officer released his grip on the boy, pushing him away roughly before standing up and stepping back. The boy, still stunned, could hardly believe what had just happened. He felt the weight lifted from his back, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, he could breathe again. His chest heaved as he scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding in his ears. "Are you okay?" the man asked, turning to the boy with a concerned expression. The boy nodded shakily, still too overwhelmed to speak. His body trembled from the shock of the encounter, but his mind was racing. Who was this man? What had just happened? And how had he found the courage to stand up to the officer like that? The stranger didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he took a step closer to the boy, offering him a hand. His eyes were kind, but there was a certain fire behind them, something fierce, something that made the boy feel like he wasn't alone anymore. "You're safe now," the man said, his voice softening. The boy hesitated, still too stunned to respond. But as he looked into the man's eyes, something inside him shifted. This man wasn't just any random bystander. There was something about him that felt different. There was a quiet strength there, an unspoken promise of protection. "Thank you," the boy said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The stranger smiled, his expression warm but intense. "No need to thank me. It's just what anyone should do when they see someone in need." The officer, now standing a few feet away, didn't speak. He didn't look the boy's way again, nor did he say another word. He simply turned, walking back to his car and getting in without a glance back. He drove off, his tires screeching as he sped away, leaving the boy and the man standing alone on the sidewalk. The boy watched the police car disappear down the road, still in disbelief. It had all happened so fast, yet it felt like a lifetime. "Are you sure you're okay?" the man asked again, his voice filled with concern. This time the boy nodded more confidently. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Yeah, I'm okay, just scared." The man nodded in understanding. He looked at the boy for a moment, his gaze softening. "I'm glad I was here," the man said. "No one should have to go through that. Especially not someone like you." The boy, still trying to process the whirlwind of emotions, nodded again, grateful for the man's kindness. But even in his relief, there was still something nagging at the back of his mind. Who are you?" the boy asked hesitantly, his curiosity finally getting the best of him. The man gave a small chuckle, almost as if he had been waiting for that question. "Name's Mike," he said simply. "Mike Tyson." The boy's eyes widened in shock. He'd heard the name before, of course. Who hadn't? Mike Tyson, the former heavyweight boxing champion, the man who had made headlines around the world for his incredible strength and skill in the ring. But here, in this moment, he wasn't just Mike Tyson, the boxer. He was someone who had stood up for him, someone who had shown the boy that even in the darkest moments, there could still be a spark of hope. Mike stood there for a moment, watching the boy who was still trying to process everything that had just happened. The air between them felt heavy, charged with the weight of the moment. For the boy, it was hard to believe that someone like Mike Tyson had just stepped in to protect him. Mike wasn't just a stranger. He was someone who had stood up in a way the boy hadn't expected, with courage and strength that left him in awe. The boy wiped his eyes, not wanting to look weak, but the emotions were overwhelming. The fear, the shock, and the relief all collided inside him. He had been scared to the point where he thought he might never get up again. But now, standing here, he felt something new, something stronger. Mike had given him something he didn't know he needed. Hope. Mike Tyson. The boy whispered again, just to make sure it was real. The boxer. Mike smiled, a soft, almost comforting smile. Yeah, the same one. But today I'm just Mike, and you're all right. The boy didn't know how to respond. He wanted to ask so many things, like how Mike had known to be there, or how he had the guts to step in when the officer seemed so ready to strike again. But Mike seemed to know what he needed without even asking. You okay to walk? Mike asked, his voice gentle but firm. The boy nodded, still feeling a bit shaken but managing to steady himself. He took a few steps, his legs a little wobbly at first, but soon finding their rhythm again. Mike walked beside him, matching his pace, not rushing but not slowing down either. It was as if Mike was giving him the space he needed, but also silently reassuring him that he wasn't alone anymore. The boy glanced at Mike every so often, still not quite believing he was walking next to someone so famous. It felt surreal, like a dream. But Mike's calm demeanor made it easier to forget the events that had just unfolded, even if only for a moment. The boy thought back to the officer, the way he had grabbed him, the way he had felt powerless. It was still fresh in his mind. But now he also had a new image in his mind. Mike standing up to that officer, unwavering and strong. Thanks, the boy finally managed to say again, his voice more stable this time. For stepping in, Mike nodded, glancing down at the boy. No one should have to go through what you did today. No one. Sometimes people don't speak up when they should, but I couldn't just watch. The boy didn't know what to say to that. He had never really thought much about people stepping in for others before. He had always just tried to keep his head down, avoid trouble, and stay out of the way. But now, with Mike walking beside him, he felt like maybe there was something more he could do. Maybe he didn't have to be quiet anymore. They reached the corner store in no time, and the boy paused in front of the door, unsure of what to do next. He had come here to pick up something for himself, but now it felt like everything had changed. Are you sure you're okay? Mike asked, looking at the boy with concern. Yeah, the boy said, his voice quieter now. I think so. Mike gave him a nod as if accepting the boy's answer, though he could see that the boy was still processing everything. There was a certain sadness in the boy's eyes, a heaviness that didn't seem to belong there, but it was a sadness that could be worked through. Mike could tell the boy wasn't just shaken by the physical pain. He was shaken by the whole experience. Being treated like that for no reason at all had left a mark on him, and that mark would take time to heal. I'll tell you something, Mike said, breaking the silence. It doesn't matter who you are or where you come from. Nobody deserves to be treated like that, ever. The boy looked up at Mike, his eyes a little wider now, a little more understanding. Mike's words, simple as they were, carried weight. The boy wasn't just hearing them. He was starting to feel them. It was like the floodgates had opened, and the boy realized he didn't have to accept things just because that's how they'd always been. He didn't have to accept being overlooked or misunderstood. He could stand up for himself, just like Mike had. Thanks, the boy said again, his voice a little stronger now. Mike smiled at him, a genuine smile that made the boy feel like he wasn't alone in the world anymore. You're welcome. Just remember, next time, if something doesn't feel right, speak up. Don't be afraid to raise your voice. You matter, all right? The boy nodded, trying to hold back a tear. He had never heard anyone say something like that to him before, not with such sincerity. The words meant more than he could say. They felt like a promise, like a shield he could carry with him, something to remind him that no matter how alone he felt, he wasn't. All right, I'll let you go, Mike said, stepping back. But remember what I said? The boy took a deep breath and smiled, his chest feeling a little lighter. I will, I promise. Mike nodded and then turned to walk away. The boy stood there for a moment watching him go, the sense of gratitude welling up inside him. Mike Tyson, the legendary boxer, had been the one to help him in his time of need. It wasn't something the boy could easily forget. But it wasn't just Mike's strength that had made a difference, it was his courage. The courage to stand up when no one else would. The boy stepped inside the store, the cool air hitting him as the door swung open. He wasn't thinking about the candy he had come to buy anymore, nor was he thinking about the officer. He was thinking about what Mike had said and how much it had changed him. For the first time, he felt like he could be more than what others expected of him. He didn't have to just accept the world as it was. He could fight for something better. As he picked up a bottle of soda and a snack, he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just relief, it was empowerment. He wasn't going to let what happened today define him. He wasn't going to stay silent when he saw injustice. He wasn't going to walk around with his head down anymore. He paid for the items and stepped back outside, the warm sun still beating down on him. The street felt different now. It didn't feel as threatening or as oppressive. Maybe it was because of the conversation with Mike. Maybe it was because the boy realized, for the first time, that he had a choice. As he walked back toward his home, the boy couldn't stop thinking about what Mike had said. His mind was clear now, the fear and confusion fading into the background. He was going to take Mike's words to heart. He was going to use his voice. And maybe, just maybe, when the time came, he would stand up for someone else the way Mike had stood up for him. The days following the incident felt like a blur to the boy. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the officer's harsh grip, the pain, the fear that had gripped him. But every time he thought of Mike, his mind shifted. Mike's words echoed in his head, the way he had stood up for him, the courage in his eyes. The boy felt a shift inside himself. A slow, gradual change. At first, the boy wasn't sure what to do with the newfound courage that Mike had left him with. It felt like something powerful, like a weight being lifted, but it also felt unfamiliar. How could he, someone who had always kept his head down, suddenly become the one to speak up? How could he use that voice? But as the days went on, he started to see things differently. The world around him seemed more noticeable, and not in the way it had been before. He began to pay attention to how people treated each other, to the small acts of injustice that seemed to go unnoticed, swept under the rug as though they didn't matter. They did matter. He could see that now. One afternoon, a few days after the incident, the boy was walking home from school, his mind still buzzing with thoughts of what had happened. He was deep in thought when he heard a voice from behind him. "Hey, wait up." He turned around to see a young girl running toward him, her backpack bouncing with each step. She was a classmate, someone he had seen around but never really talked to. She stopped in front of him, panting slightly from the run. "Hey," she said, her voice a little breathless. "I saw what happened the other day. With the cop and, everything." The boy's stomach tightened. It wasn't like he wanted to relive it. He still hadn't fully processed everything that had happened, but something about the way she spoke, soft, understanding, made him feel like maybe she wasn't judging him. "Yeah," he replied quietly. It wasn't great." The girl nodded, her eyes wide with concern. "I heard about it at school. Some people were talking about it. I just wanted to say I think it's awesome what you did." The boy was confused for a moment. "What I did?" he asked. "Standing up to the cop," she explained. "Most people would have just let it happen. You could have gotten hurt, but you didn't let it slide. I think that's really brave." The boy didn't know how to respond. He hadn't exactly done much. It wasn't like he had taken control of the situation. Mike had been the one who stepped in, not him. But still, there was something in the girl's words that made him feel proud. Maybe, just maybe, he had done something. Maybe his part mattered, even if it was just a small piece of the puzzle. "Thanks," he said finally, his voice quieter than he intended. "I didn't really do anything." "Mike Tyson did," she laughed lightly. "Yeah, I heard he was the one who stepped in. But you—" She paused, searching for the right words. "You didn't back down, even when it was scary." That was when the boy realized something. Mike had stepped in because he knew what it was like to face overwhelming odds. But the boy, he hadn't backed down because for some reason he felt like he had no other choice. When you're pushed so far, sometimes you just have to stand your ground no matter the fear. And maybe that was what made him brave. Not because he was strong, but because he knew it was wrong. The girl smiled at him, a look of respect in her eyes. I think people like you are the ones who change things. Not by fighting, but by showing that things shouldn't be the way they are." The boy didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to people talking to him like that. He was just a kid, a quiet one who didn't make waves. But suddenly the idea of standing up, of being that person who said enough and felt like it wasn't so out of reach. "Maybe," he said softly, looking down at his shoes. "Maybe we all need to do that, stand up. More people need to." The girl nodded thoughtfully. "Exactly." It's easy to ignore stuff when it doesn't affect you. But when you see it happening, and you don't do anything, that's the problem. People need to speak up when they see something's wrong. Even if they're scared, the boy smiled at her. She didn't know it, but she was making him feel something stronger than he had before. She was making him feel like he wasn't crazy for thinking things should change, that maybe he could help make it happen even if it started with small steps. They walked together for a few more blocks, talking about school and the things that normal kids talk about. Who had the coolest shoes? What music they liked, which class was the hardest. For a moment, the boy forgot about everything that had happened. It was nice talking to someone who treated him like a regular person, not someone who had been in an awful situation. As they neared the boy's street, the girl stopped. "I have to go this way," she said, pointing to the left. "But I just wanted you to know. I think you're making a difference. I mean, we're just kids, but even what we do can have an impact." The boy smiled at her. "Thanks, you're right. Maybe it's about doing what's right, not just what's easy." She grinned. "Exactly. Catch you later." As she walked away, the boy felt something new settle in his chest. It was a mix of pride and purpose. He had no idea what the future held or how things would change, but for the first time he didn't feel like he had to be silent, like he had to hide who he was or what he believed in. If he saw something wrong, he would speak up. He didn't know exactly how yet, but he knew he would find a way. When he got home that afternoon, his mom was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through a magazine. She looked up when he walked in, noticing something was different in his demeanor. "How was school today?" she asked, her voice warm but distracted. "It was fine," the boy said, though the words didn't feel right. School hadn't been fine, it had been a turning point. His mind wasn't on homework or grades anymore. It was on something bigger. "Actually, I talked to someone today. A girl from school. She said something that made me think." His mom raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "She said, people like me, like us, are the ones who can change things," he said slowly. "She said standing up even when it's scary is how things change." His mom smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "Sounds like you've been thinking a lot about what happened." "I have," the boy admitted, "and I think I want to do something about it. I don't know how, but I want to be someone who speaks up when things aren't right." His mom put the magazine down, her eyes full of pride. "That's the kind of person you're meant to be. It won't be easy, but you have the strength to do it. Just remember to always stand for what's right, no matter who's watching." The boy nodded, a sense of resolve settling in his heart. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to stand by in silence anymore. The boy woke up the next morning with a feeling in his chest that he couldn't quite shake. It was a strange mixture of excitement and uncertainty, something he hadn't felt before. The events of the past week had changed him, and he knew it. He couldn't go back to the way things were. There was no turning back now. The memories of the officer, the pain, the fear, it all still haunted him. But the memory of Mike stepping in, the courage he showed, that stayed with him too. The boy had seen firsthand what one person could do. Mike had made him believe that maybe he could do something too. Today he was going to try. He got dressed quickly, putting on his favorite hoodie and sneakers, the ones that made him feel like he could do anything. It wasn't just about the clothes. It was about the confidence they gave him, the feeling that he was ready to take on whatever came his way. After grabbing a quick breakfast, he left the house and set off toward the local community center. The community center was a place where people gathered to talk, to learn, to share ideas. It wasn't the most glamorous place, but it was important. It was a space where people could come together and speak about the issues that mattered. The boy had been there before, but never really paid much attention to what was going on. Today, that was going to change. When he arrived, he walked through the doors and was greeted by the familiar sight of folding chairs set up in a circle. A few people were already sitting, talking quietly among themselves. The boy took a deep breath and walked over to an empty chair. He had never spoken out in front of people before. He had always kept his thoughts to himself, afraid of what others might think. But now, with the memories of Mike and the girl from school still fresh in his mind, he felt a fire inside him. He wasn't going to be silent anymore. He wasn't going to let fear control him. The conversation had already started by the time he sat down, but the boy didn't mind. He listened closely, hearing people talk about the things they had been facing, how the police treated people in their neighborhood, how certain groups were treated unfairly, how the voices of the people who needed help were often ignored. It was everything he had seen and felt, everything he had been too scared to say out loud. And then the conversation turned to the topic of action. The group was discussing what could be done to make things better, how they could get their voices heard, how they could fight against the things that were wrong. The boy knew this was his moment. He didn't know exactly what he was going to say, but he couldn't stay silent anymore. Taking a deep breath, he stood up. His heart was racing, but his hands weren't shaking. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel afraid to speak his truth. Excuse me, he said, his voice a little louder than he had meant. I just wanted to say something. The group turned their attention to him, and for a moment the boy froze. But then he remembered Mike's words. He remembered how Mike had stood up without hesitation, how he had made his voice heard even when it wasn't easy. And he realized that he could do the same thing. I don't know if this will make sense, he started, his voice steadying with each word. But after what happened with that cop, I can't stay quiet anymore. I've been scared, you know. I've always tried to stay out of the way, not cause any trouble. But I saw what happened, and I realized that staying quiet, staying out of it, that's not going to change anything. He paused, looking around the room at the faces of the people who were listening. Some were older, others closer to his age. They were all giving him their full attention, and for a moment he felt the weight of their expectations. But he didn't stop. I think we all have to speak up, he continued, his voice growing more confident. It's not enough to just let things happen around us. If something's wrong, we have to say it. We have to stand up for the people who can't, because if we don't, nothing will change. The boy paused again, his heart pounding in his chest. But the silence in the room felt different now. It wasn't the awkward silence he had feared. It was a quiet that said people were thinking. People were listening. One of the older men in the circle, someone who had been talking about the injustices in the neighborhood, spoke up. You're right, kid, he said with a thoughtful look. A lot of us have been waiting for someone else to take the first step. It's easy to think that change is something that just happens, but that's not the case. It takes people like you, people who are willing to take that risk and stand up, to make a real difference. The boy felt his confidence grow. The weight of the moment was still there, but it didn't feel so heavy anymore. He wasn't alone in this. He wasn't the only one who wanted to see change. I want to help, the boy said, his voice firm now. I want to be part of making things better. I don't know what I can do yet, but I'll figure it out. I won't let fear stop me anymore. The group nodded in agreement. They didn't know what would come next either, but they knew one thing for sure. It was going to take all of them working together. As the meeting continued, the boy felt like something had shifted inside him. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. He wasn't someone who would stand on the sidelines while injustice happened. He was someone who could make a difference, someone who could speak up and take action. That night, as the boy lay in bed, he thought about everything that had happened. About the officer, the fear, and Mike Tyson's unexpected appearance. He thought about how far he had come from being a scared kid who stayed silent to someone who was ready to speak out. But more than anything, he thought about the future. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and there would be moments when he would doubt himself. But he had taken the first step, and that was enough. The rest he would figure out as he went along. He had made a promise to himself that he would never be afraid to stand up for what was right. And no matter where that journey took him, he knew he wouldn't have to walk it alone. The next day, as he walked down the same street where it all began, he didn't feel the same fear that he had felt before. The world was still the same, but he wasn't. The boy knew he was ready to face whatever came next, and maybe, just maybe, he was the one who could start the change. The next few weeks felt like a whirlwind to the boy. What started as a single act of courage, standing up to an officer with the help of a stranger, slowly turned into a movement. A quiet one at first. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do next, but every day, he felt more certain of one thing. He wasn't going to let the world pass by him anymore. It was strange. He had never thought of himself as someone who could make an impact. Before, he had always kept to the background, content to observe life from the sidelines. But now, even in his quiet moments, his mind was buzzing with ideas. Maybe it was Mike's words, or the conversation with the girl from school, or even the support he had received from people in his community. But whatever it was, it had ignited something inside of him. The boy had started volunteering at the community center, joining in on the meetings and listening to what the older members had to say about making a change. They were all talking about similar things, standing up for what's right, fighting for justice, and never backing down. Each time he listened, he grew more sure of the path he was on. And the more he contributed, the more people began to look at him differently. He wasn't just the quiet kid anymore. He was becoming a voice, a part of the solution. One afternoon, while the boy was walking to the center, he passed a group of kids his age laughing and chatting. They were talking about a protest happening the next weekend, one that was organized by local leaders to address police brutality and unfair treatment in their neighborhood. The boy had heard about it, but it wasn't until now that he really paid attention. This was it. This was the next step. His heart started to race. "Hey, are you going to the protest?" one of the kids asked, noticing him walking by. The boy froze, not knowing how to respond. He hadn't even thought about attending, but now that the idea was out there, he felt a pull. This was the kind of thing that Mike would have done. He would have been there, standing for something he believed in, speaking out for what was right. "I don't know," the boy said, his voice a little unsure. I'm just starting to get involved with stuff like this, but maybe I'll go." "You should," the kid replied, nodding enthusiastically. "We need more people like you, more people willing to stand up and be heard." The boy didn't say much more, but the words stuck with him. People like you. The boy had never thought of himself like that. People like him weren't the ones who caused trouble. They were the ones who fixed it. He had the power to change something, to add his voice to a cause bigger than himself. Later that night, as he sat at his kitchen table doing his homework, he couldn't stop thinking about the protest. He could hear his mother in the background, humming as she cooked dinner, and the soft murmur of the television from the living room. For the first time, it felt like the world outside was calling him, like he was a part of something bigger than his own small life. And that feeling was overwhelming. His mom noticed his silence and looked up from the stove. "What's on your mind, honey?" The boy hesitated, then put his pencil down. "I think I want to go to a protest this weekend," he said slowly. "It's about making things better, about standing up for people who don't have a voice." His mom raised an eyebrow, a little surprised. She hadn't expected her son to show interest in something like that, especially not after everything he'd been through. But she knew her son well enough to see that he wasn't just following the crowd. There was something genuine about his desire to get involved. "I think that's a good idea," she said softly. "But are you sure you're ready for something like that? It can get pretty intense." "I think I am," he said. "I don't want to just sit around and wait for change to happen. I want to be part of it. I want to speak up." His mom smiled, her eyes warm. "Well, just remember, it's important to stay safe. Speak up for what you believe in, but do it in a way that's going to make a real difference." The boy nodded, feeling the weight of her words. She had always taught him to stand up for what was right, but to do so with respect for others. It wasn't just about making noise. It was about making your voice count. That weekend, the boy went to the protest. He wasn't alone. The girl from school was there, as well as some of the people from the community center. They stood together in a large crowd, their voices raised in unity, chanting for justice. The boy had never felt more alive. There was a fire in the air, a sense of purpose that he had never known before. As the protest moved through the streets, the boy couldn't help but look around. He saw people of all ages, all walks of life, standing side by side. They were angry, yes, but they were also hopeful. Hopeful that by raising their voices they could make a difference. And in that moment, the boy felt like he was part of something that mattered, part of a movement that could change the world. But the protest wasn't just about being there. It was about what happened afterward. People didn't just chant and march for the sake of it. They gathered afterward in small groups to discuss what they could do next, to plan for the future. The boy joined one of those groups where they talked about how they could bring attention to their cause, how they could make sure their voices were heard by those in power. That's when he realized something. It wasn't enough to just show up. It wasn't enough to be angry and frustrated. It was about what came after, what you did once you had everyone's attention. Over the next few weeks, the boy continued to get more involved. He started organizing small events, writing letters to local leaders, and attending more community meetings. He became a voice for those who felt voiceless, and in doing so, he discovered a strength in himself that he had never known existed. He wasn't just the quiet kid anymore. He wasn't just the one who sat on the sidelines waiting for someone else to speak up. He had found his voice, and he was using it to stand up for what was right. And even though it was hard, even though there were moments when he doubted himself, he kept going. One day, as he was walking to the community center, he saw the same group of kids from before. They were laughing and joking around, but when they saw him, they stopped. "You were at the protest, right?" one of them asked. The boy nodded, feeling a little shy. "Yeah, it was really something," the kid smiled. "We need more people like you. People who aren't afraid to speak out. You're making a difference, man." The boy didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't doing it for the recognition. But there was something about hearing those words that made him realize just how far he'd come. When he got to the community center, he was greeted by the same group of people who had been there from the beginning. They welcomed him with smiles and handshakes, treating him like an equal, like a partner in the fight for change. "You're really becoming a leader around here," one of the older women said with a proud smile. The boy felt a rush of gratitude, but also something else, responsibility. He wasn't just part of the movement anymore. He was helping to shape it. His actions mattered. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the boy thought about everything he had accomplished. A few months ago, he had been the one afraid to speak up, the one who thought his voice didn't matter, but now he was someone who stood in front of others and led with confidence. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot, but he was on the right path. For the first time in his life, the boy didn't feel like he was just waiting for something to happen. He was making things happen, and he knew that as long as he kept speaking up, as long as he kept fighting for what was right, there was no limit to what he could achieve. The boy woke up that morning with a sense of determination he hadn't felt before. It had been months since the protest, since the first time he'd stood up and said what he believed in. Since then, he had found his voice and become more involved in his community. But today, something inside him felt even stronger. It was as if the fire Mike Tyson had sparked in him had grown into something he couldn't ignore, something bigger than just his neighborhood. For the past few weeks, he'd been working closely with others from the community center, planning a campaign to address the ongoing issues that had been affecting their lives for years. It wasn't just about standing up in the moment. It was about creating real change. And now the time had come. Today was the day they would meet with the local officials to present their ideas and push for action. The boy's heart raced as he walked to the community center. He had worked so hard for this moment, but the closer he got, the more the weight of the responsibility settled in. What if they weren't taken seriously? What if the officials dismissed them the way they always had, thinking they were just a group of kids with no power? He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. Mike's words echoed in his mind. "You've got to raise your voice when you see something wrong. Even if you're scared, even if it feels impossible, you stand your ground." The boy nodded to himself. He wasn't just standing up for himself anymore. He wasn't just the scared kid on the sidelines. He was a part of something bigger. He was fighting for his community, for people who couldn't fight for themselves. When he arrived at the community center, the others were already there, gathered around a table, papers spread out in front of them. Everyone was focused, preparing for the meeting. They had worked tirelessly on their proposal, highlighting the need for better police training, community support, and a fairer system for everyone, no matter their background. The boy joined them, taking a seat at the table. He could feel the nervous energy in the room, but also something else: hope. It was the same hope that had brought them all together, that had kept them moving forward despite the odds. They believed that today could be the day they would finally be heard. "All right, everyone," the leader of the group said, her voice calm but firm. "This is it. We've put in the work, and now it's time to present our proposal. We're going to be calm, clear, and we're going to stand strong." The boy felt a surge of confidence. He had spoken at meetings before, but this was different. This time, his words would matter more than ever. He wasn't just sharing his opinion. He was sharing a vision for a better future, one where things could change for the better. The meeting with the officials took place at the town hall. As the boy walked into the room, he couldn't help but feel small. The room was filled with important people. People who had the power to make decisions that affected his life and the lives of everyone he cared about. They were sitting at a long table, their faces serious, their eyes focused on the papers in front of them. They looked up when the group entered, and for a moment the boy felt the weight of their gaze. But he took a deep breath and remembered why he was there. He wasn't alone. He had the support of the community, the strength of everyone who believed in this cause. And he had his own strength, the courage to speak up when others wouldn't. The leader of the group began to speak, outlining their concerns and the steps they believed should be taken to make a real difference. The boy listened intently, but his mind was already preparing what he would say when it was his turn. When the leader finished, the room fell silent. The officials looked at each other, exchanging glances. Then one of them, a middle-aged man with glasses, spoke. "This is a very serious matter," he said, his voice deep and measured. "But these things aren't easy to solve. They require time, resources, and cooperation from many different sides. We can't promise you immediate results, but we will listen. We will take your concerns into account." The boy felt a knot in his stomach. He had heard that line before. "We'll take it into account." It was what they always said to avoid taking action. But today he wasn't going to let them get away with it. When the boy stood up, his legs felt a little shaky, but his voice was steady. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the officials one by one. He wasn't just talking to them. He was talking to everyone who had ever been ignored, to everyone who had been treated unfairly. "Excuse me," he said, his voice louder than he expected. "I know you say it's not easy, but it shouldn't be this hard to treat people with respect. We shouldn't have to beg for fairness. We shouldn't have to prove that our lives matter. And we shouldn't be silenced when we speak out against the injustice we see." There was a brief silence in the room as the boy's words hung in the air. The officials didn't speak right away, but the boy could see that he had made an impact. They were listening. "I know it's not easy," the boy continued, his confidence growing, "but that doesn't mean we give up. We've been fighting for change for too long. We've had enough of being ignored. And today we're asking you to be part of the solution. We're asking you to listen, to act, and to make things better for everyone in this community." When he finished, the room was still quiet. The boy sat back down, his heart pounding in his chest. He had said what needed to be said. He had spoken up not just for himself, but for everyone who had been overlooked, for everyone who had been silenced. He wasn't afraid anymore. The officials exchanged a few more words, then the middle-aged man spoke again. "You've made your points clear," he said. "We'll discuss this further. We'll look at your proposal and see what steps can be taken." The boy wanted to be angry. He wanted to shout that they had to act now, that they couldn't just keep pushing things aside. But he knew that change didn't happen overnight. It was a process, and he had taken the first step. He had spoken his truth, and now it was up to the officials to listen. As the meeting came to a close, the group left the town hall with mixed feelings. They hadn't gotten the immediate response they had hoped for, but they had made their voices heard. They had pushed for change, and they weren't going to stop now. As they walked back to the community center, the boy felt a sense of pride. He had done it. He had stood up, spoken his truth, and made an impact. The fight wasn't over, but today they had made a difference. Later that evening, as the boy sat in his room, he thought about the meeting. He thought about how far he had come, from the quiet kid who had been afraid to speak up to the young person who now stood in front of others with confidence, ready to make change happen. It hadn't been easy, but he had done it, and he would keep doing it no matter how hard it got. He smiled to himself, knowing that the fight for justice wasn't over, but he was ready to face whatever came next.